It was a crisp morning at Andrews Air Force Base, with flags fluttering in the breeze as thousands gathered for President Donald Trump's much-anticipated speech honoring military service. Families, veterans, cadets, and active duty members stood in neat rows beneath the rising sun. Among them was Caleb Monroe, a 24-year-old airman with a freshly pressed uniform and nervous eyes. His mother had driven all the way from Ohio to see him honored with his unit. But Caleb wasn't focused on the speech. He gripped a crumpled, worn letter tightly in his hand. He glanced up at the giant screen showing Trump approaching the podium. The crowd erupted in applause as Trump waved, nodded to military officials, and began his speech. "I'm here today to thank the brave men and women of the United States military. You are the reason this country stands tall and proud." Caleb swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He wasn't one to seek attention, but today was about truth, honor, and a promise he'd made years ago. As Trump spoke on, Caleb's grip tightened on the letter, tears welling in his eyes. Behind him, an older veteran noticed and asked, "You, all right, son?" Caleb nodded, but his mind raced. He knew he had to act before it was too late. Looking back at the stage, the words he'd rehearsed 100 times echoed in his mind. He wasn't just another airman in the crowd. He was there for someone who never got the chance, and what he was about to do would change everything. 3. Years earlier, Caleb was just a high school graduate from rural Ohio. His father had died when he was 9, and his mother worked 2 jobs to support them. His best friend, Derek Sandoval, had been his rock. Derek's father had served in the Air Force and inspired them both. They often dreamed of enlisting together, determined to serve their country side by side. "I'm going to be a pilot," Derek used to say with a grin. "You'll be the serious one. I'll fly over you and wave." They laughed at the thought. In their senior year, they made a pact. No matter what, they'd enlist together. And they did. But fate had other plans. 6 months into basic training, Derek collapsed during a morning run. He had hidden symptoms: dizziness, fatigue, chest pain, too afraid it would disqualify him. It was an aggressive heart condition, and he died within days. Caleb was shattered. At Derek's funeral, he made a promise to his friend's parents, something he hadn't told anyone else. Kneeling by the casket, he whispered, "I'll serve for both of us, and someday I'll make sure the world knows who Derek was." Today, that day had come. The letter in Caleb's hand was one Derek wrote during training, a letter never mailed, addressed to the future president. Now standing just feet away from the president himself, Caleb knew it was time to fulfill that promise. He stepped forward, heart pounding, letter shaking in his hand as Trump's voice carried over the loudspeakers. "This country owes you everything. Our future is brighter because of you." Caleb took a deep breath, stepped out of formation, and called out, "Mr. President." A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned, security instinctively reached for radios. Caleb raised both hands, letter held high. "I'm sorry," he continued, voice steady, "but I need to say something just for 1 minute, please." Secret Service agents started moving. One gestured for Caleb to step back, but President Trump raised his hand and said, "Wait." The entire base fell silent. Trump looked at the young airman. "You have something to say, son?" Caleb nodded. "Yes, sir. It's not about me. It's about someone who should have been here today. Someone who never got the chance." Trump stepped back from the podium. "Come up here." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Caleb's legs moved without thinking, climbing the steps, letter still clenched. Trump handed him the mic. "Go ahead." Caleb faced the silent sea of uniforms and families. "My name is Airman First Class Caleb Monroe. I wasn't supposed to be standing here alone. I joined the Air Force with my best friend Derek Sandoval. We trained together, dreamed together, but he died before he could serve." Caleb held up the letter. "He wrote this before he passed. It's addressed to you, sir. May I read it?" The president nodded slowly. The crowd held its breath. Caleb unfolded the worn paper carefully, fingers trembling. "Dear Mr. President," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "If this ever reaches you, it means something amazing happened. Maybe I became someone worth listening to. The crowd was silent, even the wind seemed to pause. My name is Derek Sandoval. I'm just a kid from Ohio and I've just begun Air Force training. I don't know if I'll make it. It's hard. But I wanted to tell you something. Caleb's voice steadied. Serving this country isn't just about medals or recognition. For me, it's about hope. I come from a town where kids stop dreaming by the time they're 16, but when I put on this uniform, I felt like I was part of something bigger. Caleb looked up, emotions choking him, then continued. I don't want to be remembered as brave or strong. I want to be remembered as grateful. Grateful for the chance to wear this flag. Grateful to serve alongside my best friend. Caleb, if I don't make it through this journey, I hope he does. I hope he serves for both of us. And I hope one day someone hears my story, not because it's special, but because there are thousands like it. Tears filled the eyes of those watching, soldiers, parents, generals, all silent. Caleb closed the letter. He had promised to carry Derek's memory, and today he fulfilled that. Trump stood motionless, then stepped forward. What he said next stunned the entire crowd. President Trump looked Caleb in the eyes and said, "Thank you, Airman Monroe. That was something the nation needed to hear." He took the letter gently, folded it with care, and placed it inside his jacket pocket. "This will stay with me forever." Then Trump turned back to the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's ceremony was meant to honor our military, but it just became something greater, a reminder." He paused, glancing around at the crowd. The rows of service members and guests sat in silence as President Trump spoke. "We often celebrate medals and victories, but today we honor a promise kept, a fallen airman, a brotherhood, and the heart of America." Then, in a rare and moving gesture, Trump turned to Caleb and saluted him. The crowd, stunned at first, burst into applause. Not for Trump, nor for the speech, but for Derek and Caleb, who had carried his friend's memory with courage. Behind Caleb, an officer wiped away tears, cameras flashed, and social media exploded. Overwhelmed, Caleb stepped back, but deep inside, for the first time in 3 years, he felt at peace. As he left the stage, he was surrounded, not by reporters, but by soldiers. A general clapped him on the back. "That took guts, son." Another young airman whispered, "I lost my brother in Iraq." "Thank you." A mother sobbed into Caleb's shoulder. "You reminded me of my daughter. She didn't make it home." Even hardened Marines had misty eyes. Caleb couldn't believe it. He'd only read a simple, heartfelt letter from a boy who never got his chance, yet that was what made it so powerful. He hadn't expected the attention. Part of him even felt guilty standing in the spotlight. When Derek wasn't there to share his story, the people saw it differently. They saw honor, truth, and maybe, for the first time in a long while, a speech that truly mattered. Not because of who gave it, but because of what was said. Backstage, Caleb found a quiet corner and pulled out a worn photo of Derek in uniform tucked inside his wallet. "We did it, bro," he whispered. "I kept my word." In that moment, surrounded by strangers turned supporters, Caleb Monroe realized sometimes the smallest voices make the biggest echoes, and his had only just begun. Within hours, videos of the moment went viral. Clips of Caleb reading Derek's letter flooded news feeds, and hashtags like R for Derek, R the promise, and silent letter trended worldwide. News anchors praised the airman who interrupted the president, and even networks usually critical of Trump applauded his response. Celebrities joined in. Actor Mark Wahlberg posted, "That's a hero." NFL star Jonathan Parks wrote, "This young man just reminded us what real sacrifice looks like." Even Elon Musk added, "I hope that letter ends up in a museum someday." It belongs to the nation. But for Caleb, none of that mattered. That night, back in his bunk, he stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. Across the room, his phone buzzed non-stop with texts, emails, and interview requests. He ignored most, until a message from an unknown number caught his eye. "You don't know me. I served with Derek's dad. What you did today, brought him back to life for a moment. Thank you. Finally, Caleb let a tear fall. This wasn't about fame. It was about remembrance. Back in Ohio, Mrs. Sandoval, Derek's mother, sat frozen in her recliner, watching the broadcast for the 5th time that day. She clutched a photo of her son in one hand and a crumpled tissue in the other. He really did it, she whispered, voice trembling. Caleb really kept his promise. Derek's father, once a stoic airman himself, had passed away 2 years after his son. The grief had left a void in. The Sandovals' home had felt heavy with grief, but that day, with Caleb's voice echoing through the television, something shifted. The house seemed warmer. Through tears, Mrs. Sandoval picked up the phone and called Caleb's mother. "Your boy," she said. "He gave me my son back today, if only for a moment." They cried together. In a town where sorrow had dimmed every window, Caleb's act ignited a new hope. Not just for the Sandovals, but for every parent who ever wondered if their child's story would be remembered. Back in Washington, President Trump returned to the White House and quietly took Derek's letter from his jacket. He read it once more, then again, before placing it carefully in a drawer reserved for deeply personal items. Later that evening, in a private meeting with his closest staff, he said, "We're doing something special for that airman. I want a ceremony, not for politics, but for Derek." His team nodded and began planning a national tribute to honor stories like Derek's, marking a rare moment when the government responded not to polls or headlines but to a single letter from a young man with a dream and a loyal friend who wouldn't let it die. A week later, Caleb received a formal letter bearing the presidential seal. With shaky hands, he opened it to read President Trump's invitation to join him at the White House to present Derek's letter to the country, along with his mother, and, if willing, Derek's mother. Caleb's heart raced as he showed the letter to his mother, who broke into tears, and when he called Mrs. Sandoval, she was silent at first before whispering, "Yes, he would have loved that." Dressed in full uniform, Caleb stood in the Oval Office beside his mother and Mrs. Sandoval as President Trump welcomed them warmly, shaking each hand with quiet respect and saying, "This isn't politics today. This is personal." He turned to Derek's mother and said, "Ma'am, I want to personally thank you for raising a young man like Derek. His words changed the way I see service." Mrs. Sandoval clutched Derek's photo tightly and gave a soft nod. Trump then opened a box and handed Caleb a folded American flag. "This flew over the White House yesterday. I want you to have it." Then he added something unexpected. "We're going to name a new Air Force Leadership Scholarship after Derek Sandoval." Caleb gasped, and Mrs. Sandoval's knees weakened, but Caleb caught her. "It's called the Sandoval Honor Scholarship," Trump continued, "for young people who embody sacrifice, leadership, and loyalty." The room fell silent except for Mrs. Sandoval's quiet sobs and Caleb standing taller than ever. 1 month later, a national ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery, where veterans, generals, and Gold Star families gathered to honor fallen service members. A special segment was dedicated to Derek Sandoval, and Caleb was asked to speak again, this time with Mrs. Sandoval beside him. "I'm not a hero," Caleb began. "I'm just a kid who kept a promise. The real hero was my best friend, who never got to wear the uniform outside of training but lived like a soldier, every day." He held up a copy of Derek's letter. This letter is now preserved in the Library of Congress, but its true value isn't in history books. It lives in every young person who chooses to serve something bigger than themselves. The crowd stood in respect, and then something extraordinary happened. One by one, veterans in the audience saluted. The tribute to Derek sparked something far greater than anyone expected. Air Force recruitment centers saw a sudden rise in interest, with many young people citing Caleb and Derek's story as their inspiration. Several schools started Letters to the Future programs, encouraging students to write about their dreams for the country. At a high school in Texas, a student read Derek's letter aloud during morning announcements, and the entire school listened in complete silence. A teacher later said it was the quietest she had ever heard the building. Talk shows, morning news, and even late-night hosts shared the story, not for drama but for its raw honesty. When President Trump mentioned Derek's name again during a speech to Congress, even some political critics stood to applaud. This wasn't about party. It was about principle. Weeks later, Caleb returned to Ohio and made one solemn stop before heading home. Derek's grave, where he knelt in full uniform, and Caleb placed a small wooden box at Derek's headstone. Inside were a copy of the White House flag, a photo from their Oval Office visit, and a letter he had written himself. Dear Derek, you made it, bro. The world knows your name. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but you always believed this would happen. You saw something in both of us. Thank you for teaching me what real service means. I'll carry your story for the rest of my life. Your brother always, Caleb. He stayed there for hours, and when he left, the grave was no longer just a marker. It was a monument to a promise kept. Months later, Caleb reluctantly appeared on a national talk show where the host called him the Airman who silenced a nation. Caleb laughed and said he wasn't trying to silence anyone, just wanted someone to hear Derek. When asked what he'd say to Derek if he were here, Caleb didn't hesitate. I'd say you mattered, you still matter, and your dream didn't die with you. It's flying higher than ever. The host wiped a tear as the audience gave a standing ovation. Caleb smiled sheepishly, still adjusting to the attention, and said, I'm just a kid from Ohio. That's what Caleb called himself. But America saw much more. They saw the soul of the nation shining through him. The next school year, the first Sandoval Honor Scholarship recipient was announced, Lena Hart, daughter of a single mother and an aspiring Air Force engineer. In her essay, Lena wrote, I want to serve in the name of those who couldn't, like Derek Sandoval. I never knew him, but his letter made me believe in something again. Mrs. Sandoval attended the ceremony and hugged Lena afterward, saying, You're part of his legacy now. Lena replied, He's part of my dream. The scholarship program grew, soon supporting dozens of students nationwide under Derek's name, a boy who never left training, now helping others take flight. Caleb returned to duty, and one day while running drills, his superior officer pulled him aside with a call from the president's office. Caleb's heart skipped as he answered. A White House staffer told him, The president wants you to know that during his final address this term, he will close with Derek's words, calling them the purest definition of patriotism he's ever read. Speechless after hanging up, Caleb whispered to himself, You really did it, Derek. Millions watched President Trump's final address of the term, where in his closing remarks he read directly from Derek's letter. I don't want to be remembered as brave or strong. I want to be remembered as grateful. He paused, then said, This young man never wore medals, never saw battle, but he taught this nation what it means to love it. Looking into the camera, to Derek, to Caleb, to every silent voice, he added, We hear you now. The screen faded to the American flag. Years passed and Caleb never sought the spotlight again. He finished his service, became a mentor to new recruits, and settled into a quiet life in Colorado. But every year on Derek's death anniversary, Caleb received a card from the Sandoval family that always said the same. You kept his promise. We'll never forget. At the Air Force Academy, Derek's photo now hangs beneath a plaque titled, The Letter That Echoed. One day, Caleb stood before a group of new cadets holding a worn piece of paper. This letter, he said, was written by someone who never got to serve but still changed the world. He handed out copies and added, Never underestimate your voice. You may think you're just one person, but one voice spoken with love and truth can change a nation. The cadets stood silently, then saluted, just like before, just like always, and the promise lived on.